Konbanwa, ladies and gentlemen. All debates go for theoretically the same length of time, but some end much, much earlier. The problem for the affirmative team in this case was that they decided to draw a lesson from the basis of Iranian policy, a land known for its free and fair elections policy, its wonderful energy policy, and they've taken a leaf out of the wonderful social policy of Iran that allows the government to raid the bodies of those who need it most, harvest them for organs for those that need it least, all in the name of public health. Ladies and gentlemen, we think it's an outrage and we don't think it should happen anywhere in the world. There's three questions I want to raise in today's debate. First is this question of the shortage, second is about the limits of bodily autonomy, and third is about equity and fairness. Firstly, the shortage. The shortage of organs is the animating reason for the entire government case. We think it is ultimately a house built on sand. First, they said that there's a problem with the quantity of organs working through the system. Number one, we don't accept their premise that alternative mechanisms like an opt-out system of organ donation have actually been tried and have been proven not to work. Like, number one, they generally haven't been tried, and two, where they have been tried, like in Singapore, they have worked to solve the organ shortage. So the second objection we'd say about the quantity is that at some marginal point, embracing this system undermines the incentives to develop things like xenotransplantation or taking pigs' organs and putting them inside me, or alternatively like prosthetic organs. But thirdly, and perhaps most critically, we recognise that the system of voluntary donation, whilst it has its imperfections, largely does still work, and that actually commoditising what people are giving freely and voluntarily at the moment, not only does that mean that the government spends lots of money that it otherwise, or private individuals spend lots of money they otherwise would not have to, but actually undermines the incentives for people to donate in the beginning. So when in the US and UK in the 1980s, they allowed the sale of blood to people. People could sell a vial of their blood in order to have more blood in the market and more blood transfusions. On a net level, the amount of blood available to hospitals and doctors went down. Because while some people decided to sell it, those people who were donating it before decided that their voluntary charitable choice was no longer voluntary and charitable and stopped donating. So we think this system will come at the price of the large numbers of organs that are donated voluntarily. The second problem they had was in terms of quality. Now, we objected to this primarily because that analysis was only true for things like organs that you need to actually keep yourself alive at this very moment in time, like your heart, which we think are always going to be difficult to transplant, given that you need your heart to live. But more importantly, it's not true of what organs we're talking about here. Like, if there were non-essential organs, and we don't accept they are things like kidneys and bone marrow, which we think don't require immediate transplantation. Like, if there are problems in the existing network of distribution, like there are problems at getting them from people who have died to people who need them, fix those problems, because there's not the time imperative, the false time imperative they suggested. But more importantly, when you can see that people are importing organs at the moment, that concedes that time is not of the essence. And that brings me to the third element of this shortage, about the black market. We don't think it's a problem at the moment that it is, it's a massively hyped up debating argument to suggest that there is a big market in organ tourism. But two, if it is a problem, we think we should crack down on the problem. Get tough on the rich Western people that are going to developing countries and harvesting their people for organs. This leads me to the second issue I want to talk about, which is in relation to bodily autonomy. The proposition began by saying there's nothing intrinsically harmful about this procedure, because you're allowed to donate to family and friends at the moment, ergo, you should be allowed to sell. Well, we don't accept that smooth distinction is as smooth as they wanted to say it is. Because when you create a financial incentive to undertake this procedure, which is qualitatively different from the incentive you might have of just wanting your friend and family to stay alive, you make the incidence of this procedure way bigger across the board, but also you change the framework of consent. And that's the second thing that we would say, is when you introduce money into this situation, it undermines the quality and integrity of that consent, because the compensation and money that you're paying clouds the level of rationality that you're bringing to the scenario, because you overstate short-term economic necessity at the expense of long-term risks. And the one example they gave us of where someone might be making this decision was someone who, in order to keep their mother alive, needs to effectively blind themselves. We say under that sort of emotional, financial scenario, you're necessarily going to be in a situation where your rationality is reduced and where you have less capacity to freely consent to the long-term harms. And that's the two other points we'd make about consent. Like, the risks, firstly, haven't materialized in this instance for many years. So you don't know the risk, but the risk will materialize when you're missing a kidney at 50 and you've been living a life such that you need that kidney. But secondly, we don't accept that doctors are particularly effective gatekeepers at guarding against this risk, because they can't know the risk that will materialize in 20 or 30 years. Logan.
So, under your logic, if I give my kidney to my mother because I want her to stay alive, I'm not fully consenting, and that I shouldn't be allowed to do that.
No, what I'm saying is that we can generalize across a class of person, right? Like, sure, in like one situation you might be able to freely, rationally consent to this. But when you introduce as a regulatory setting the provision of financial incentives in order to pay people for their organs, you can generalize across that class that consent will generally be less valuable and less integral because there's a perverse financial incentive for somebody to do something. So we can generalize across the basis of that class. This is not a social policy setting that we think we should have. This brings me to the third argument that I want to make about equity and fairness. We think this allows rich people to effectively opt out of the public healthcare system. We say, A, in principle, that is just unfair. So that a rich person with liver disease or kidney disease can just buy their way out of that disease, while a poor person who can't afford it doesn't get the same level of support. But secondly, it reinforces a public-private distinction in the healthcare system, where when you don't have rich people forced to sit in the waiting queues and middle-class people sitting in the same system as everyone else, you undermine the integrity of that public healthcare system, because the number of stakeholders in that system is reduced, and therefore less people care about it, less people fund it, fewer people actually make it good. Mr. Speaker, we happily oppose this silly motion.